is the DeFi Decoded podcast by 9 Point Partners. The ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast should not be taken as investment advice. Always consult with your financial advisor before investing.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of DeFi Decoded. I am Alex Tapscott. Over the past few weeks, we have witnessed how the U.S. regulatory situation has become more difficult for companies operating in that country. It's not all bad news. There's been lots of really exciting innovation. Overall, we saw PayPal announcing a stablecoin. We saw Circle merging with Coinbase, and we saw BlackRock filing for a Bitcoin ETF. Our guess is that they would have only done that if they felt pretty confident that it would be approved. But overall, it seems as if the regulatory environment in the United States is becoming more challenging. We've also talked a lot about how, when the industry closes a door, it opens a window somewhere else. So countries like the United Kingdom, where Rishi Sunak announced that he wanted to make the country a center for Web3, or announcements and proclamations from countries like Dubai and Singapore, and even Hong Kong, which has opened up, showing that there may be a bifurcation in terms of how the world is approaching this technology. So it's always, a question of it's Web3 in the US or not. Well, in this case, it's kind of the US's opportunity to lose. So in the midst of all of this, there's a third country. Well, there are lots of countries, but one in particular that I think a lot of people are curious to understand how we're approaching it, and that's Canada. So at 9 Point Partners, we were one of the first to launch a Bitcoin ETF trading on the Toronto Stock Exchange. 2.5 years later, that's still not approved in the United States. So in some respects, Canada is ahead of the game. But in others, I think it's taking a cautious approach, and in some cases, even following the lead from other countries, including the US. So I'm no expert in this area. And to make sense of all this, we really do have the perfect guest to help us navigate this changing landscape and get a clear picture of what's happening in Canada and frankly beyond that. So Mark Greenberg is the MD for Canada at Kraken. Kraken is, to people who are in the industry, not a name that is any surprise. They're one of the larger exchanges in the world and also one of the longest running exchanges in the world. Mark is a fintech business builder who's passionate about making financial services better for everyone using technology. He's got a really interesting background, which we're going to dig into and just to get a clear sense of how he ended up in crypto at Kraken. But also, I think that gives him a really unique perspective on this as well. So Mark, thank you very much for joining us on the show. Welcome.
Alex, thanks so much for having me.
Terrific. So let's start with that first bit. How did you get into all this stuff? What was the path for you to become MD of Canada for Kraken?
Oh gosh, it's a bit of a winding road, but I spent a whole chunk earlier in my career really focused on the traditional financial services space. And it's not a secret, even to those who were my bosses inside the industry, that industry is pretty broken and that there are tons and tons of opportunities to make it better. And whether that was my time working in Eastern Europe, setting up a new bank, whether it was my time launching a team in Colombia and dealing with currency devaluations there, whether it was some of the pieces we were dealing with around settlement, there were just tons and tons of frustrations in the traditional banking space. And more of those answers were just in crypto. And spent a lot of time. My most recent role was at Scotiabank here in Canada, one of the largest Canadian banks, and spent a lot of time trying to convince them that some of the answers they were looking for in making their experience better for customers was solvable through crypto. Started with some easier businesses that maybe for a traditional financial player like custody, and struggled a little bit to get that kind of traction. That led me to get more and more frustrated because the solves were out there. They were easy. They were things people could use, and a lot of TradFi players were maybe a little bit less excited about them. Led me to speak to Dave Ripley, our CEO, and have a little coffee with him here, and just get excited about maybe being able to take some of those solves that I couldn't figure out inside the bank and trying to solve them from outside. So the passion hasn't changed. It's about making financial services better, and crypto is darn well the best way to do that, I think, for Canadians and around the world.
When you were at Scotia, were you trying to bring crypto assets to the bank? Were you trying to bring those solutions to the bank, or was it more just embracing technology in general as a way to help address problems and improve services for everyone?
Yeah, so my role was focused on technology transformation, and blockchain was a piece of that. Open banking was a piece of that. Crypto assets were a piece of that. I would say every time the conversation started on crypto assets, it was shot down very quickly. So it never got as far as maybe I would have dreamed or hoped. And while there were some teams in very early ways looking at it, I don't think it was ever a serious agenda. But it was definitely a passion project of mine, something I was always excited about, and something I hope the Canadian banks will eventually get to, but not at this point.
I think that you're right about that. Based on the conversations that I've had, they don't view it as an existential risk, right? And banks are really risk averse for good reasons. But that also makes them reluctant to be innovators, to push the envelope. So I think it's going to be up to companies like Kraken and others to show the way, and then maybe eventually they'll be fast followers, as they say. So you joined Kraken from Scotiabank in October of, I think it was last year, right? So about a year that you've been in the role. What were the three things that surprised you most when you joined a firm like Kraken?
So I joined in October, and a lot of news happened in October. So it didn't take me very long to in those very early days at Kraken, had a lot of questions, right? I had some of them before I joined, and I had them after I joined. What I was most excited about was just how deep the focus at Kraken was around security, around stability, and around client service. And that really, really proved itself out over those first few weeks and months as I was taking on my role. I think maybe the most interesting thing I learned in those early days was just how hard it was to combine those principles, which had run really deep, with some of the regulatory regimes we had in Canada and elsewhere. Canada is one of our first markets where Canada, through this pre-registration process, has some rules around segregating client assets with a qualified custodian. That meant we had a long conversation in those early days about whether Kraken wanted to trust a qualified custodian, whether we wanted to continue to hold the crypto ourselves. And some of those, I guess, principle-based decisions in those early days were some of the most fascinating things to me, and things that we worked really heavily with the regulator to make sure we could stay true to our values while still supporting them.
Yeah, I really like that. Well, I've always thought of Kraken as sort of the trust minimizing platform, right? Like it's very much, this has been my experience, very crypto native, very assumes that its clients are savvy, and generally speaking wants to know very little about the clients and take on as little risk as possible. It really, I think in a way, is very empowering for users who want to be their own bank, custody assets, and to maintain their privacy. But ultimately, those principles, which I think are laudable, do come up against regulations from time to time, right? You might have know your customer requirements in different countries. You may be required to, custody assets on behalf of others, depending on the rules and regulations. So how do you think about growing the business in a way that stays true to the roots of being a crypto native organization, while also, staying on the right side of regulators, but also growing in a way that attracts broader and broader kind of customer base, right? Because there are lots of institutions, high net worth individuals, and retail holders of these assets who may want their hand held a little bit more.
Yeah, I think let me answer the last part first, and then I'll go back and talk more about regulators. I think it's our job and duty to offer as many choices to different types of consumers as we can. Some are going to want to custody their own assets and use non-custodial staking services like stake.us, our business there.
Yeah.
Some are not going to want to go through that hassle and understand that, and are going to want to custody assets with us. Some are going to want to trade on a spot market and trade margin and those types of things. And some are going to be more excited to buy and hold. And we're going to continue to have to provide services, approaches for all of those different types of customers, and make sure that they all feel excited to use the Kraken platform. And that between Kraken Pro and our new Fusion product on web, and Kraken for consumers, even having the multiple of apps, I think provides that kind of experience, which is really important. With regulators, I'll leave I'll just talk about Canada because I think it's a good example of how it can work. I've found we have a regulator here that is willing to listen, is interested in our point of view, and is open to learning through this process. And one of the things that's been important to me is just spending as much time with them as we can to make sure that we educate them, we help them understand that our values between the regulator and us aren't that different. They care a lot about keeping clients safe. They care a lot about security. They care a lot about price transparency and small spreads, tight prices. And those are things we care about too. And so at the end of the day, the differences in the principles weren't very great. It was just some of the implementation approaches that they had in mind that maybe were a little bit more complex or more frustrating to us. And that meant that we negotiated, we discussed, we debated, we spent a lot of time with the regulator to come to the pre-registration undertaking, which we did a few months ago. Mm-hmm. Is it perfect? No. There's lots of things we would change if we could. But is it a lot better than when we started in that process? For sure. And that's a testament to a regulator that wants to learn about crypto and wants to learn and wants to make it work for Canadians.
So can you describe that pre-registration process? Because that seems like kind of legal jargon that maybe our listeners aren't familiar with. What exactly does it mean to be pre-registered versus, say, registered, for example?
Yeah, for sure. So let me go all the way back. So there's actually two different regulators that matter in Canada. The first is called FINTRAC, and they focus on money services businesses. In the TradFi world, that would be people like Western Union or MoneyGram as an example. And they're responsible for things like know your customer and anti-money laundering and those types of topics. They've been registering crypto companies for a long time. Actually, we've been registered as a money services business with FINTRAC since 2019. Mm-hmm. More recently, the securities commissions in Canada, of which there's actually one in every province. So I'll just talk about our main one here. We're based in Ontario. It's the Ontario Securities Commission. They have defined some types of crypto contracts as securities, and that means there's a registration process specific to that. That process is still ongoing. Most of the big cryptocurrency exchanges that have remained in Canada are still going through that registration process to become a restricted dealer, which is a requirement. Right. But we were asked to pre-register and basically agree to participate by the rules while we went through the registration process, continued to finalize the paperwork. So we've been pre-registered as of March, and hope that our more formal registration will come over the next few months as we continue to work with the securities commissions across Canada to finalize some of the policies and procedures.
So in the pre-registration period, are there any limits to what you can or can't do that will become available to you when you are fully registered?
Yeah, so at this point, 90 days after that pre-registration, most things had to go into place in Canada. So if you're a Canadian trading on Kraken, you will see most of those restrictions already. What are they? I'll say most of them a user won't actually see day to day. There are some disclaimers, a change to our terms of service, a risk policy, and some things that will pop up, crypto asset statements. All of that is relatively benign for the end user. A crypto asset statement, as an example, is a document that describes each of the crypto assets that we sell on the platform, and we make it available to the user just before they go to trade, say, Bitcoin or Litecoin. The good news is most of those things will be relatively transparent to the user unless they're actively seeking it out. There are a few more complicated restrictions that we've been working through. The biggest one is a limitation on margin. And so most retail margin has not been offered in Canada for quite a while now. And that was probably one of the biggest restrictions. And the second one is a limit to the amount of crypto assets, net crypto assets, that a user can buy in Canada. And so for most users, that will be something in the range of about $30,000 of crypto assets will be the maximum net that they're allowed to buy within any one given year.
Interesting. And so, assuming that you do become registered, what will you be registered as exactly? You said an exempt or a restricted
Yeah,
dealer.
a
Now,
restricted dealer and an exempt marketplace. So
an exempt
those are
marketplace.
legal terms.
Our listeners kind of understand, they may think of like a broker dealer in Canada or in the United States, like someone who offers, full range of broker services. Is that the same thing, or is that like where you're ultimately going to end up? Is as that sort of a broker for all intents and purposes, like a dealer, a broker dealer, but for crypto assets?
Yeah, so basically, there are specific nuances which I won't bore anyone with, but at the end of the day, a restricted dealer is
Anybody who's still listening to this podcast, and you're into your bear market, is in it for the boring details. So I feel free to like dig in.
I'm going to nerd out in my lawyer.
Yeah,
My
please,
lawyer
please
hat on
do.
for a second. I'll say a restricted dealer is basically a broker dealer designed specifically and only for crypto assets. And so
Right.
we're not allowed with this license to trade equities or stocks or bonds, but we are allowed to trade crypto assets. And it has many, but not all of the same rules as a broker dealer in many ways through the Securities Commissions.
Right. Okay. And so another thing, recently Coinbase announced that they've, entered Canada, and you're talking about how you've begun the pre-registration. You're in pre-registration stage for registration, but the reality is like these companies, non-Canadian companies, have been operating in Canada for many, many years. And I'm curious, like having been here for this long, how big is the business in Canada today for Kraken? Like how much are you actually doing in this country?
Yeah, so I'm a little curious about that announcement last week too, but I'll leave it there.
I'm not saying you just announced that you're entering Canada, but there seems to be 2023 seems to be the year of like the it's like the debutante or something for the exchanges. Like we've always been here, but now we're really out and about or something. I don't know. I don't know what it is, but there seems to be this push to make that kind of proclamation. And I want to get into the dynamics in the market in a second, but just tell me about what's Kraken in this country today.
So Kraken's been in Canada for 10 plus years at this point.
Yeah, exactly.
As I said, we've been registered as a money services business since 2019. We have more than 250 employees, Krakenites here in Canada. And
wow, that's amazing. Where are they located mostly?
Yeah, all across the country. So we're a fully remote company, and They are located across the country. We have a very small headquarters based in Ontario for regulatory purposes. But other than that, Krakenites predominantly work from wherever they see fit. And I can't, the hardest part of the Canadian business. So I can tell you, what I can tell you about our size is that we are larger. From what we can tell, we are larger than any of the local Canadian players at this point, with a number of the global exchanges also having decided to exit Canada. We are definitely one of the top 1, 2, 3 exchanges based here in Canada. And we've always been deeply committed to this market, so nothing new or different there. Obviously, 2023 is the year where the requirements to register have come into force, and that creates an opportunity, but also a requirement to decide whether to double down. And Kraken obviously was very excited about that fact and has focused on it. But at the end of the day, Canada's an important market for us. It's one where we can, given the clear regulatory pathway that exists here in Canada, it's one where we can invest with some certainty and some clarity.
Yeah,
and it's a market that's near and dear to our hearts, and right on message for our focus to continue to expand cryptocurrency around the world. So,
yeah, makes total sense. So let's talk about the competitive landscape in this country. So you mentioned that you've been here for 10 years. I mentioned that Coinbase has also been around for a long time. Gemini as an exchange is available to Canadians. I think you've got to be accredited in order to use the platform as a Canadian. So not something that's useful for all users. Binance is out of Canada, having, I think, failed to fulfill the pre-registration requirements. And then you mentioned the Canadian competitor. Now there's this company that it used to be 5 companies, and it's all been merged into one. And I think it's going to continue to operate under the brand WonderFi, though the other exchanges exist. So what, you know, how do you think this is all going to play out? Because right now you could say that you are all you're competitors, like that's an obvious thing. But at the same time, the pie is really small. And if you believe, I think, as I do, and I think you do, that the underlying blockchain and tokenization is going to drive lots of innovation in finance and in trading of all assets, then platforms like Kraken and WonderFi and Coinbase all stand to gain from the growing of the pie, right? So, what's your strategy, I guess, in thinking about competition and growing the market and trying to win in this country?
At the end of the day, I'm lucky to work here at Kraken for a company that is principles focused. And the more we focus on those principles and providing the most amazing service we can, I think the rest will continue to fall out on its own. And that is this focus on stability and security, the focus on customer service. And we definitely have the best customer service here in Canada, and tight trading spreads, which is more and more becoming an issue in Canada as well. We're actually the only exchange in Canada at this point with Canadian dollar trading pairs. And so if you want to trade on the spot market from your Canadian dollars into Bitcoin or in Ethereum, Kraken is actually the only place to do that where you're using the spot market in an actual exchange to do that transfer.
Sorry, go ahead.
We could talk for hours about that, and I think it's important to actually. But at the same time, I think the market is smaller today than it was. And some of those Canadian competitors you named had been losing money for a long time with subscale products.
Yeah.
All the same costs of a big global player like Kraken, but not the same user base to spread those costs across. And that's become more of a challenge, obviously, given the I don't even want to say bear market, but the market over the last little while. And that's going to continue.
Why don't you want to say bear market? Markets go through bear and bull markets. It's okay.
It is it is in some ways a bear market. In other ways, crypto's quite up this year, right? So Bitcoin's up, what is it? Even with the most recent drop, it's up 40-50% this year. So I will, from a not great low, but not, are we starting to turn? Are we not? I'll leave that to smarter people than me, but I don't know if we're fully in a bear market.
Well, I mean, to your point about Kraken being principles based, it's also been at it for a really long time. So, it's gone through several cycles, and each time it goes through a cycle, the high gets higher, the low gets higher in terms of valuation and price and so forth, but also in terms of like adoption and functionality and utility, right? So, your firm more than any other, I think, would be the one that would kind of shrug their shoulders at the price movement and just keep on building. Would be my guess.
Yeah, and that's for sure. So going back to what I was saying earlier, I think we are in a position to continue to build through tougher markets, and we continue to do that. We're in a position to build globally and deploy locally, which is something that is great as a global player and much more challenging if you're a local player solely to Canada. And as more regulatory regimes get more complicated, as there's more compliance costs associated with them, it's important to be able to build to define those things globally and build them as much as we can globally. It'll continue to make it easier for us to operate at prices which are fantastic and with tight spreads, which are really important for our users.
Yeah. The fact that WonderFi has a full broker-dealer license, is that something that allows it to do things that you can't do? And is that something you would hope to kind of work towards over time?
Yeah, so all of the companies that have pre-registered and will eventually register as restricted dealers are required over time to move towards yet another regulatory body, which is now called CIRO here in Canada, which offers...
It used to be called IROC, right?
Yeah, exactly, called IROC originally. Yeah. And it is responsible for licenses that will be closer to a broker-dealer license. Does that today... It's a double-edged sword to some extent. So staking is offered in Canada through our restricted dealer licenses and our pre-registration, but it's actually not offered through Xero at this moment. So the company that has a full broker-dealer license here in Canada is not allowed to offer staking at this moment. Over time, they do hope to be able to offer some other products, but much the same way we went through a long period of time where we helped the Ontario Securities Commission and the Canadian Securities Administrators learn about crypto, this new regulator has to go through that same journey over the next coming months and years. And as they do that, we will be there along the way, and we will move towards that license as it makes sense, as they are, as they more fully understand how best to regulate a crypto company like ours.
Got it. So overall, it sounds like you're pretty pleased with the situation in Canada as a business builder and as an executive. You said this is a country you feel comfortable investing in and operating in. So what can other countries learn from how Canada is doing things, and what are some things that Canada could learn from other countries and how to improve?
Yeah. First, I think regulatory certainty is the name of the game. And we're lucky, as I said, Canada has that regulatory pathway. It allows us to invest. And I think more and more we're seeing other jurisdictions create that same certainty, whatever it is. And I hope we'll see jurisdictions like in the United States and otherwise move towards that model over time. Secondly, I do believe that that partnership, that open discussion is something that's worked really well in Canada. And it is something that that we value greatly and has allowed us to create the flexibility that we needed on our side to register and be a part of the ecosystem. When you are a global cryptocurrency company like ours, we do have some global policies and approaches and processes which are hard to change for any one individual country, especially as markets are moving in different ways with different regulatory regimes. And so that openness and that willingness to come to the table to learn about our business and try and find a way to meet the principles of regulation as much as the specifics of regulation is really important. I would say maybe the next piece I would love for us to take on in Canada, for the regulators to take on, would be we have this really interesting head start. You mentioned the ETF that you guys started a few years ago. We in Canada have a number of those products. Kraken actually doesn't, but it's a really exciting part of the Canadian marketplace. We have this regulatory regime now. It would be awesome for us to get back to those early days of crypto, where actually the first ever Bitcoin ATM was based in Canada, and Ethereum was. We were talking before, and Ethereum's maybe the biggest startup to ever come out of Canada. And I would say that we need to do more to build our regulatory regimes to be able to export that, to build upon that, and that's where I hope things, whether that's a continued focus on making cryptocurrency easier to use through capital gains exemptions for small purchases here in Canada, whether it's making it easier for ETFs to have customers outside of Canada for a predominant amount of their assets under management. There are ways that we can use the regime that we have a head start on to continue to export for Canadians.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. You mentioned Ethereum. I think I've mentioned this on the show before, but Ethereum is definitely the most successful business venture, enterprise, startup, whatever you want to call it. I mean, of course, it's not a company, it's a network with a native token, but it is a thing that has got a valuation of $200 billion and is this platform that's being used by thousands of developers and countless users. And it was originated in Toronto by a group of Canadians, largely, though there were some other people as well, obviously, who collaborated on this new technology. And many of them left. And if you ask them, a lot of them would say that they left because of uncertainty, whether they felt comfortable building in Canada or somewhere else. I think probably it was inevitable that even if the regulations were perfect, many people would have decamped to other places. That's the natural way of things. But you can't help but feel that there was maybe a lost opportunity at the time to solidify Canada and the Toronto Waterloo corridor as one of the main sort of hubs in a hub and spoke system globally. I think that unlike previous eras of the web and previous technology revolutions, innovation is not going to happen in one single place. The Silicon Valley of the future is not going to be some location somewhere. It's going to be everywhere. And if anything, Kraken is kind of an interesting example of that. It's a organization that's remote only or remote first and decentralized around the world. And so innovation is going to happen, everywhere to everything all at once. But I think that there's a lot that governments can do to create the conditions for business to be successful. And there's a well-known, principle in business that in general, investment slows when regulations are uncertain. Like you said that in your comments, you said, regulatory uncertainty or regulatory clarity rather is the thing that gives you confidence to invest and to be in Canada. So if nothing else, that is obviously a big help. I can't help but think that there's more that could be done. It's one thing to create the conditions or to set the rules of the road for a circumscribed set of kind of use cases or companies. But it's quite another to set a policy agenda for creating an innovation economy around a new technology. And that's the thing that I think is really interesting. Now, I'm holding this report up. It's the Blockchain Technology, Cryptocurrencies and Beyond report from the House of Commons. They actually commissioned this report. And it's a really thoughtful document that goes beyond creating rules, which are important, to how does Canada fit into this future. So I think that is the topic for another episode of DeFi Decoded. If you want to be part of that discussion, we'd love to have you. I'm thinking maybe a roundtable or a group chat for our audience, because now that we've created the conditions for businesses to feel comfortable investing, and Kraken is putting in more time and effort into this market than ever before, which is great. Where do we go from here? What's the next step? So some other time. But I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us today. This was a really, really interesting discussion. Mark, pleasure. And if you're interested, we'd love to have you back. So thank you very much.
For sure, Alex. Thanks so much. Always fun chatting with you. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks. Take care.
The information contained herein does not constitute an offer or solicitation by anyone in the United States or in any other jurisdiction in which such an offer or solicitation is not authorized, or to any person to whom it is unlawful to make such an offer or solicitation. Prospective investors who are not residents in Canada should contact their financial advisor to determine whether securities of the funds may be lawfully sold in their jurisdiction.